Hello, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching a video on history of leaders of thought. Today we will be doing Xenophanes and Confucius, or as it is in Chinese, Confuzi. So yeah, without further ado, let's begin. So Xenophanes, despite the fact that he considered himself Greek, he was actually born in Colophon, Ionia, which is modern-day Western Persia, or it was in the Persian Empire, but modern-day Turkey. So you could even consider him an Eastern philosopher. Probably I'd consider it Central Eurasia. But regardless, not much is known about his early life. Supposedly, he wasn't born from a particularly wealthy family, so it's pretty all the power to him for achieving such great success. And so really nothing really notable happened in his early life, but at the age of 25 he left his home and decided to live abroad pretty much for the remaining portion of his life, where he pretty much traveled from city-state to city-state, never really settling down for too long in any certain area. It's supposed that perhaps for a time he was an exile in Sicily, or a fugitive in Sicily. He was perhaps in Aaliyah when it was establishing itself as a colony, as he had written about the establishment of a colony, but nonetheless he was always sort of moving around and always on the move, both spreading his ideas but also gaining some in the process as well. It was probably very instrumental in his learning that movement and that traveling. So he's I would say predominantly both a poet and a philosopher. As for his poetry, he wrote in what is called classical hexameter. So I've written down or taken a little snapshot of what classical hexameter was. So classical hexameter was the same style of poetry that Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey in, and many other great epic poems are written in classical hexameter. Essentially, to sum it up, it basically goes... they're divided up into 6 feet or 6 foots, and each foot has about either 2 long syllables or a long and 2 short syllables, called a dactyl and a spondee, respectively. So basically the sound is like da-dun, 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 like 6 times for each line. And it's, I think, particularly meritorious because they have long lines, which makes it efficient for both storytelling and as well for Xenophanes' style, which was mostly satire. So the main objective of his actual satire was probably that he didn't actually write much of his philosophy in this, but it was mostly satirical poems directed towards both Homer and Hesiod. So I thought about including Hesiod and Homer both in the history of leaders of thought, but they were more storytellers, and they probably led the world in terms of ethical thinking, but they did not approach thought and learning in a mechanical way as all the people in this video series do to some extent. So Xenophanes really criticized them for many reasons, mostly in regards to religion. So he sort of criticized the conventional concept of gods that they had in Greece at the time. So in Greece at the time they had they believed in this pantheon of gods where there were many gods who engaged in crimes against each other. He said that he thought that the gods were just a projection of what the Greeks sort of decided of them. He says, here's this quote, "If cows and horses had hands and could draw, cows would draw gods like cows, and horses would draw gods that look like horses." So he thought that it was sort of naive to believe that the gods were very much like humans. And he also says that they attributed to God all sorts of things that are matters of reproach and censure among men, such as theft, adultery, and self-deception. So basically he thought, if there is a God, why are they so imperfect? And he's actually even takes this argument further, supposedly, as none of these writings actually still exist, but supposedly he actually philosophized a monotheist religion where there was one God that was And here's a quote to exemplify this: "God is one, supreme among gods and men, and not like mortals in body or in mind." So, kind of drawing back to this example, if horses and cows could create or could write down their own gods, why would God be in man's own image? So, supposedly, this God that he hypothesized was is circular in shape, but neither subjected to time or matter. So, it's sort of it's everywhere and it's nowhere, and it's not like the traditional pantheon of gods that they had in Greece at the time. So something risky, and I sort of did this for artistic style. Here is a picture of Xenophanes, and down here is a very small picture of Zeus. So I did this, and you probably can't even see it from, especially if you're watching this on a mobile. But the point of this is that it was pretty gutsy of him to, I think, criticize the existence of Zeus, and especially considering he was considered such a powerful figure. And I think that was a pretty noble and pretty risky thing for him to do at the time. But yeah, so otherwise he thought that also there's no divine hierarchy. That also goes back into the pantheon. And he, in terms of metaphysics, so he put many people were still believed in speculation, the traditional way of speculating as to how the world works, but he really believed in observation was the only real way of analyzing the universe. So what he perceived, and sort of similar to Thales as we discussed before, he saw two extremes, wet and dry, and also Anaximander as well. Anaximander also believed in this binary notion, but he saw two extremes. There is wetness and dryness, and water and earth. So essentially he saw the universe as like these two, I guess you can call them, parameters, and throughout time everything fluctuates between water and earth and wetness and dryness. And humans are sort of caught in the middle of this, sometimes going completely extinct and sometimes being created. And he observed this through seeing fossils in the ocean, and he hypothesized even that there was a time when the whole earth was covered in water, so the absolute extremes, for example, so absolute water and absolute earth. So he hypothesized that extreme, and I think that showed quite a bit of forethought to derive such a conclusion just by seeing these fossils, and quite a profound finding that is, especially for the time and even today, largely correct based on our current knowledge. So he also hypothesized, sort of similar to some of the previous Greek philosophers that we've discussed, he believed that there were multiple worlds, however, not simultaneously. So he didn't believe that there were perhaps aliens per se, but he believed that the world had been destroyed and recreated multiple times. And I think this sort of alludes to some of the previous philosophers that we've discussed in his concept of infinity. And that sort of draws back to his belief of the monotheist God who is not subjected to time. So these are really abstract thoughts that I think we sort of take for granted. The concept of infinity, infinite time, I just think it showed a ton of forethought for his time. And yeah, so in terms of epistemology, so the very last thing we'll discuss, and I think probably maybe his greatest conclusion, or maybe which sums him up or is most descriptive of his character. So epistemology is the study of the truth of reality, essentially. So he saw that the absolute truth to reality does exist, but it cannot be discovered by humans. So everything can only be backed up by hypothesis, and the more hypotheses, the more one can believe in their belief, but without a hypothesis, one cannot believe in one's existence. So to kind of draw a parallel and to further explain this fact, think of René Descartes. I think, therefore I am. So I think René Descartes was obviously familiar with Xenophanes, and he attempts to solve Xenophanes' problem. So Xenophanes believes that nothing can be truly believed unless it can be tested. So René Descartes, hundreds and hundreds of years later, responds, I think, therefore I am, so that he believes there is a foundation in terms of reality. I wonder how Xenophanes might have responded to that, and maybe I'll talk about this more once I get to René Descartes, which probably will be some time because I keep adding more and more thinkers to this list. But also another answer to this, but also they obviously didn't know each other because did not overlap in terms of time, but Buddha believed that in one of his 4 noble traits was that suffering exists. So if suffering exists, therefore one exists. And I also saw a parallel in Brothers Karamazov. So the 2 of the brothers both struggle with their existence and also religion, notably Ivan and Dmitri. But they both sort of come to this conclusion, both differently, in different ways, in that since they are suffering, although it is painful, it proves that they do exist. And I think to draw even more modern example is a lot of discussion goes into whether or not we're living in a simulation. And, if simulations do exist, would we be feeling such suffering? I actually think yes, because when you watch a movie, it's essentially like a simulation, and you don't watch a movie just for the absolute essential orgasm or the absolute lack of pain, but the suffering is an important feature of all great literature, all great films, and even all great music. But so I don't think it necessarily really answers Xenophanes' question, to sum it up. So I hope that makes sense. So Xenophanes essentially believe that there is no proof that reality exists, and many other people, both in Eastern philosophy and in modern Western philosophy, have tried to solve this answer. And I perhaps still stand by Xenophanes' belief. I think therefore I am is it's good, but I don't think it. I think Xenophanes would have had difficulties coming to grasp with that. But yeah, I put up this quote. He was actually probably not called a silographer in his own time, but that essentially means one who writes satire. Another quote of his: "It takes a wise man to recognize a wise man." Another wise quote. And yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about Xenophanes in the comparison. So yeah, moving to Confucius, or Confuzi in Chinese. Confucius is sort of the Latin adaptation of Confuzi. So Confuzi actually means Master Kong. So his family chain is the Kong family chain. His father's name was Kong He. His name originally was Qiu Zonghe, which he got the name Zonghe when he became an adult. So that means he was essentially the second son of his family. So not the eldest, but he might have had younger siblings. We don't know that. But he was born in present-day Khufu, China. His father was an elderly commandant in the local militia, but he died when Confucius was only 3 years old. So he was raised in poverty because obviously his father couldn't bring a lot of money onto the table, being dead, and he was raised predominantly by his mother. And at the age of 19, he was married, and at the age of 20, he had a child. So a bit early for modern times, but pretty conventional at the time. And he studied at a normal school. He came from the Shi lineage, which would have been sort of midway between aristocratic and common people. So slightly, we call it middle upper class. And he studied at a common school, which was focused on the classical education at the time, the 6 arts, which includes rites, which is like rituals and sort of the practices of religion or the implementation of religion, rites, music, archery, charioteering, calligraphy, and mathematics. So I don't know, sounds like a pretty fun school to me. But yeah, so he proved to be quite intelligent, kind of like Xenophanes. Xenophanes was said to be a great student, even though very little is known of him being a student. But Confucius was a great student, so it allowed him to rise through the ranks. and he spent time as a bookkeeper and an animal caretaker. So he cared for like sheep and horses, and he spent much of his money raising it for his mother's funeral. So at the age of 23, his mother died, and he's had his typical 3 years of mourning. So I think not only does this demonstrate his thankfulness to his mother, but also his belief and the significance he put on family, which is a common theme throughout much of his writings. So in terms of politics, he won a lot of favor in the local politics because he was generally pretty neutral to the households, so they thought of him as a fitting person to rise through the ranks, and he eventually got up to the Minister of Crime, so a pretty powerful position, and one particularly fitted to one who is has a sober thought. So one thing that he did believe, though, despite his impartiality, was he wanted to destroy the walls around his local town, and also neighboring towns as well, to strengthen the central government, the Duke of Lu. So a lot of, obviously, the nearby aristocrats didn't support this, but Confucius sort of approached this through a non-violent way. Eventually it did get violent, and he got offered a lot of positions to take up violent roles, but he largely led this essentially rebellion in a peaceful way. But one of the earlier concepts of centralization in China. But I'll get to that later, how the Communist Party eventually sort of shames him. But so eventually he leaves at the age of 25. So he was a favorite of the court, the Count of Lu, so a very powerful central government figure. But he saw that this count was getting a little bit corrupt. At one point, this count is given a bunch of women and a bunch of party like drinks, I suppose, like alcohol and such, and he avoids all his duties for 3 days. So he thought that despite his belief and support for central government, he thought it was time to leave because he no longer really supported the government. On a sort of side note, though, and it's explicit throughout his writing, is that he actually didn't support democracy. He thought that the general people did not often did not have the intelligence to vote effectively, and he believed in absolute government and centralization. So eventually he decides to leave. So when the Duke of Lu doesn't holds this party and avoids all of his duties, at this time he doesn't actually leave because he doesn't want to embarrass the Duke of Lu, but instead he waits until he does a small, more minor infraction by not giving him his Confucius's shared sacrificial meat. So this is kind of, I think, I'll get to this individual later. Sun Tzu says, or to paraphrase him, "Don't outshine the master." So obviously he no longer supported this person, but he did not want to make an enemy of this person. So eventually he leaves, and he spends he doesn't return until the age of 68, and he goes around sort of similar to Xenophanes. So Xenophanes, despite going around all of Greece spreading his ideas, I think this was also very instrumental in Confucius's case, in establishing his own ideas. So I think the travel both allowed him to gain publicity, but also to really flesh out his philosophy and his beliefs. So when he returned, he had supposedly had maybe 72 or 77 disciples who ultimately helped in creating the Analects posthumously, and what's called the 5 Classics. So I suppose to sort of sum up his philosophy, obviously, as mentioned earlier, he believed in centralization. He believed in wasn't a big proponent of democracy, but he believed that well, firstly, in his writing, he was a transmitter of these ideas. He didn't believe he was inventing anything new, but he thought that rules and laws were not the best approach to governing people. He thought that they had to rule through reason. So, for example, if they had a bunch of laws, people would follow or behave ethically for the laws, but they would not. They would be naive and they would not have any moral basis. In terms of, he thought that the government needed to rule through rights. So he thought the government needed to have some sort of religious grounding to their reason for governing, which I think is probably can be related to his anti-democratic beliefs, in that if they have some sort of religious backing, then they don't need to be elected in. I think that was probably one of the main reasons. And he believed that they shouldn't lead through bribery or coercion. They should lead through, and they should lead through a mandate of heaven. So I guess kind of similar to Lao Tzu, the best way to really understand Confucius, like you can talk about him all day long in the abstract and not really understand him. The best way is to actually read them and read his some passages from Confucius, all of it if possible, but it would take a very long time. But here are some passages and really flesh out what he was thinking and what he believed. So I believe this is probably one of my favorites. Where is it? When the stables were burnt down on returning from court, Confucius said, "Was anyone hurt?" He did not ask about the horses. So this is not that he necessarily prioritized human life over that of animals. It's more that he believes the significance of life is more important than materials. So I think that's a nice one. Confucius said of Nanrong, so Nanrong was an individual he supported, "In a well-governed state, he will not be overlooked for an official position. In a badly governed state, he will avoid punishment and disgrace." Confucius arranged for him to marry his niece. So going back to what I said before, is that he did not really believe in, common people or even state officials interfering too much in the wishes of the government and the state. So if the state is badly governed, he didn't believe in, an uprising or fighting. He said just avoid punishment and disgrace. So if things are bad, kind of don't do anything and just settle down. If things are good, contribute to it. So that's his sort of approach to politics, summed up, I think, very nicely in that one. Confucius said, "It is beautiful to live in a neighborhood that is filled with goodness. How can someone be wise if they choose to live in a place that lacks goodness?" So this is, I kind of think of clean your environment, clean your head. So he sort of believed that the environment had a big influence on one's what goes on within one's head, which I think is true. I think the best way to clean up your own mind is to clean up your own room. So a man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones. So sort of explicit. Rome wasn't built in a day. A man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones. Oh, sorry, I put the same quote twice. Then I guess since I put it twice, I might as well expound on it. I like this other quote. I'm not actually sure who it's from, but he says, "Rome wasn't built in a day, but similarly, Rome wasn't destroyed in a day." So I think that's an interesting message that isn't mentioned a lot. And this actually I didn't get from Confucius. I'm not actually sure where it comes from. I cannot remember, but just as same thing with a mountain. A man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones, but a man who destroys a mountain begins by carrying away small stones. So that's how things all get built, and that's how things get defeated. I think that's just a nice message. Another one is this is probably the most important rule amongst all religions, and I think almost every person almost believes in this, It's called the Golden Rule in respect to Confucius. Also considered the Silver Rule sometimes because it's considered in the negative. But either way, so Zigong, one of his disciples, asks, "Is there any one word that could guide a person throughout life?" And the Master Kong, or Confucius, says, "How about reciprocity? Never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself." So very simple. Don't do that onto others which you would not expect upon yourself. And he said, that's the one word that could sum up how to live one's life. And I think that's a nice way to close it. So I guess to move into the comparison between the two, Xenophanes and Confucius. So they're similar in that they did not really, especially compared to their contemporaries, they were not as focused on God or the soul and sort of abstract thoughts, but they cared more about logic and sort of critical thinking in approaching their philosophies. So I think that's pretty explicit and pretty evident, and I think that's also very similar for all of these people I would consider leaders of thought. It's obviously it's very nice to create a god like Zeus who will punish you for doing such and such, but to give them a logical reason why they should not steal, for example, do not onto others as you would not expect upon yourself, that is, I think, a little bit more meritorious and might stand the test of time a little better. They're both descriptive rather than instructive. So they both sort of describe the world, but even in Confucius's case, where he gives lots of examples of great things being done, he does not explicitly give rules, and he was actually quite against rules. Same thing with Xenophanes. He sort of described that there were no multiple gods and there was probably one god, but he did not tell them what this god expected of people. So I would say they were descriptive rather than instructive. In terms of differences, Confucius obviously believed in big government. He believed in centralization, and actually, sorry to jump back on this, I was going to mention how he got shamed ultimately by the Communist Party of China. So Mao Zedong at one point criticized Confucius, saying that the Confucianism didn't give enough respect to the common people. And Mao Zedong obviously was a champion of the common people. And he said if China ever were to come, or to paraphrase him, were to ever come to a time where they needed to go back to Confucianism, they would no longer be a state. So despite them supporting the centralization factors of Confucius's philosophies, he did not like that he sort of neglected the common people. But yeah, so going back to the comparison with that, Confucius believed in big government, whereas Xenophanes was sort of on the opposite end. He did not really care about government at all. In fact, he sort of shamed common military practices, and he even thought such conventions as athletics as a waste of time. So quite different in that regard, whereas one believed in making a large influence on politics, whereas the other really didn't care at all. They yeah, I guess that's the main differences I would say between the two. So yeah, I hope you enjoy this video, and I hope you watch the next one. And further, I hope this video might inspire you to read more up upon both of these two individuals. I think Xenophanes is a bit more difficult as a lot of his writings don't exist, but there's thousands and thousands of pieces of literature on Confucius, particularly his Analects, which are nice little reads. You can sit down for just 5 minutes and read some of these nice little passages, and I think it would add merit to your life. So thanks so much. I hope you watch the next video, and I hope you watch some of the preceding. Thanks so much. Bye.